Beauty Revealed, Self-Portrait, 1828. Read for you by Daisy Ridley. Nowadays, if someone hits upon the generally well-meant but pretty wearisome idea of setting you up with someone you don't know, you don't need to stumble blindly into your first date, but can arm yourself with advance information. You can comb through social media to see what the person looks like, what they think, or at least claim to think, and how they present themselves in public. In the early 19th century, matchmaking was a different kettle of fish. As a young woman, you'd have been brought to market, usually by your parents, sometimes by a so-called matchmaker, and had few opportunities to form a picture of your future intended. Men, too, didn't always get to see candidates in real life, but had to trust other people's descriptions. Since it wasn't just one evening at stake, but the rest of their lives, men, with whom the decision lay, wanted to get a rough idea of the face they'd be looking at every day in future. So they liked to have their potential spouse's portrait painted. The lovely film Portrait of a Lady on Fire by French director Céline Sciamma is a good examination of this tradition. A young woman is to have her portrait painted, from her best side, of course, so that her fiancé, who is somewhere abroad, can have the pleasure of seeing her. Only, the stubborn lady refuses to sit for any of the painters. She doesn't want to show her face, doesn't want to marry at all, doesn't feel understood by these men with their paintbrushes and easels, and bristles at having a stereotypical sales portrait made of her. She remains steadfast until a woman comes along and paints her just the way she sees her. Not as a sweet little woman with a gentle gaze who dreams of nothing but marriage, children, and a household, but as a complex being, a real person. The breasts portrayed in this painting, under the title Beauty Revealed, tell a similar story. They too speak of the wish to be seen as the person you feel yourself to be, instead of being forced to fit into a ready-made picture. Sarah Goodrich, who painted this self-portrait in 1828, clearly felt comfortable in her own skin. Unlike Sciamma's protagonist, she didn't wait for another woman to paint her from a female perspective, but instead took matters into her own hands. Instead of painting her face, her shoulders, perhaps even the top of her décolletage, she shows herself only in the form of her naked bosom. It shines almost three-dimensionally out of the painting, beautiful and full, with rosy nipples. On Instagram, it would have been taken down within seconds. This 6x8 centimeter watercolor wasn't just a selfie of a woman who thought herself beautiful and wanted to show off, but was very much part of a tradition in which women painted portraits for their future husbands. Yet the man in this case, a certain Daniel Webster, had no idea how lucky he was. In the early 19th century, Sarah Goodrich was working as a successful miniaturist in Boston, the city that would later become so feminist, if two women lived together, it was referred to as a Boston marriage. She wanted to marry Webster, and this was the way she chose to tell him. She and Senator Webster had been corresponding for many years. When his first wife died, Goodrich scented an opportunity and offered herself as his next wife by sending him this self-portrait. Miniatures were very fashionable back then. They were a way of carrying your nearest and dearest with you at all times, just as people would later slide passport photos of their families into their wallets. Only, then as now, it was mostly faces rather than body parts on display, and certainly not breasts. Sarah Goodrich didn't care. Everything about this move was exceptionally brave and brazen. The fact that she didn't wait for Webster to ask her, but made her own quasi-proposal of marriage to him. That she showed him a part of her he clearly hadn't seen before, thus telling him she wasn't just a good girlfriend and excellent miniaturist, but something else too, a sexual being. But what's also interesting is the way Sarah idealized her breasts, much in the way she herself might have been idealized in a regular portrait. She was 40 when she painted this self-portrait, and it's rather unlikely that the breasts flashing back at her in the mirror really looked this plump, fresh, and rosy. Yet, she was clearly clever enough to know that self-portraits, just like seduction, aren't about reality, but about how a person wishes to be seen and what they want someone else to believe. In a time in which the male gaze, the objectivizing eyes of a man on a woman and her body, was steadily becoming a significant feature of the urban landscape, with idealized images of women increasingly being used to promote goods in Europe and America, she simply allowed herself to see her own body, to wit, to see it in a way that pleased her. This was unbelievably progressive. At that time, female self-expression was regarded as shameless. Whether Mr. Webster appreciated this modernity is something we will sadly never know. He chose another woman. But he never returned Sarah Goodridge's wonderful bosom to her. Her breasts remained in the family until the 1980s, when they were auctioned off at Christie's. She herself painted 2 further self-portraits, this time with her clothes on.